All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com.
Hello, and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History. I'm Nicole Hemmer. I'm once again wresting the microphone away from Jody Avirgan, who has fled the country, and using this time to explore the history of my new adopted state of Tennessee. But today we are going to talk about a different state, the state of Franklin. You know how we at this state love a short-lived breakaway republic, and boy, do we have a good one for you. In this month, August 1784, the state of Franklin broke away from North Carolina in what is now eastern Tennessee. I say broke away from North Carolina. That's not quite right. North Carolina gave it to the federal government. The federal government was like, what are we supposed to do with this? And then North Carolina decided it wanted the area back. And finally, the citizens of Franklin were like, screw you guys. We're creating our own state. So we will get into all those twists and turns. And to help us out, as always, is Kelly Carter Jackson of Wellesley College. Kelly, hello.
Hey there. Super excited to be doing this.
I know. It's an all-lady show.
I know. I feel like we're going rogue.
And our special guest this episode, Tennessee native Jane Carr. Jane is also a brilliant editor at CNN. It's so good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I have to say, my home state is getting a great one. Excited to see you in the state of Tennessee, Nikki.
Aw, thank you. Okay, so Jane, you know, when I was in grade school, I think fourth grade, we had this whole sort of section on state history. In my case, it was the history of the state of Indiana. And that's where I learned all of the little weirdsies of Indiana history. When you were taking Tennessee history, did the state of Franklin feature prominently in that?
Well, I have to say my Tennessee history experience was in the sixth grade, and I can say with absolute certainty that the state of Franklin did not come up. You know, I would say that some of its key figures, John Tipton, John Sevier, did come up later in the story of the state of Tennessee. But this is all news to me and, you know, really exciting news at that to learn more about.
Well, we will talk about the two Johns at the heart of this story. Everyone in the 18th century is named John or George or William, right?
That's so true.
You know, I have to say, though, you know, in reading more about the state of Franklin, it seems like the mythology of it looms really large in eastern Tennessee. Is there a reason why you all the way over in Memphis are not getting a lot of state of Franklin history?
Well, I have to say, you know, John Sevier enters my, you know, Tennessee history lexicon as the first governor. But Tennessee is really, broken down, we learn growing up, into West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and East Tennessee. And as someone growing up in Memphis, native Memphian, you really think of yourself as being a part of that city and not necessarily part of the state of Tennessee writ large. So if someone asks me, usually, where are you from? My first response is, I'm from Memphis. So, you know, I would say my experience might have been different as a school child growing up in East Tennessee, but growing up as I did in West Tennessee, I didn't learn as much about it. The strongest memory I have of Tennessee history growing up is having to memorize the 95 counties.
There are a lot of counties.
Oh my God. That is like a trivia question I would never get right.
I think that knowledge lasted long enough for me to pass the exam, and then it went somewhere else.
Yeah, you made room in your brain for more important things.
Fair.
I think a lot of people don't realize, though, that like Tennessee is, during this time period, it's the great frontier. Like, no one is thinking about it as a southern state or as a even in the middle of the country kind of state. It is way out there. It is Indian country. It is not something that the United States is like vying for or trying to get its hands on or even really trying to grow exponentially. We see that later with like the Louisiana Purchase when the United States doubles, its size and territory. But for the most part, this is not territory that's seriously considered in that way as a political factor that the United States has to expand.
I think that is one thing that came up as more distinctive in that sixth grade context. Like, growing up there, it definitely feels, you're part of the Deep South, and to sort of, get that education and get a sense of that wildness that really defined the area early on was really interesting.
Mm.
That wildness is really important to this story. So at the time, state of Tennessee doesn't exist. North Carolina basically runs from the ocean to the Mississippi River. And so these counties that are going to break away and become the state of Franklin are part of North Carolina. And at the time, we're talking the 1780s. So this means we're under the Articles of Confederacy. There isn't a strong federal government. There's no way to levy money from the states to pay for things. So one of the things when the states owe the federal government money is that they sell off land, and that land pays things off. And that is kind of the thinking that both concern about cash and that concern about the frontier and trying to secure the frontier are the two big things that are driving North Carolina to say, actually, these counties, why don't you take them? We're fine with you taking them. And I think you're right, Kelly. Like, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that western frontier, because we think of the U.S. as like this expansionist country, but in the 1780s, there is this wariness about going too far west because you don't have the ability to actually secure that land.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of the Industrial Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, the big booms that we see that really come in the 19th century in terms of like westward movement and mobility just really aren't there. And so when you are navigating these territories, they're completely underdeveloped in a lot of cases. There's swamps. It's dangerous. Or you're in Native American territory in which there are no treaties, and it's also dangerous. And so people really aren't willing to sort of go it alone. There's not a lot of settlements or establishments where people can kind of operate as an isolated front. And I think that's what makes it so difficult for this country to serve as its own entity, because there just isn't the federal or state infrastructure put in place to make it a viable country or territory.
Yeah, they do try to become an effective government. And that's actually one of the cool things about these things in the 18th century is everyone's kind of making it up as they go along. Like the federal government's making it up. The states are making it up. The state of Franklin, which is, so these folks, they're not controlled by the federal government. They're not controlled by North Carolina. And so they say, hey, actually, we're going to be our own state. So they decide they're going to be the state of Franklin. They set up a government and they start issuing marriage licenses. They start building roads, and they're becoming a real state. How would you describe, Jane, kind of what the state of Franklin was like in those few years that it was in existence?
Well, one thing that really stands out to me is, how much of it is kind of predicated on this financial arrangement, right? And the other thing that really stands out is, just how chaotic it is. We're looking at these leaders, John Sevier and John Tipton, they're competing for power. And so much of what they're doing, to try to expand has to do with their treatment of indigenous peoples. And that's something that I think is really crucial, that I wish I would have learned about when I was studying Tennessee history. I mean, I think school children do get a really fraught sense of, how, later with Andrew Jackson and other notable Tennesseans, how central the treatment, the attempt to take land from indigenous peoples was to the project. But I think with the state of Franklin, you can really see, how that, hostility and that violence were really a central part of, how they wanted to establish themselves.
Yeah, and I should say, I don't want to make it seem like Western or Eastern Tennessee is like a blank slate. Native American tribes and the Cherokee are very much there, and these wars are ongoing. You know, they're constantly trying to fight for their own sovereignty. The Cherokee are, and so it becomes this, you know, major battles that are taking place over who is going to control this land. And those battles go into the 19th century. It's not until you get the Trail of Tears where you get that Indian removal. But for the most part, you know, if you are a settler coming into these places, you are not alone.
Absolutely. You know, you could really see, you know, I don't want to say delusions of grandeur, but in terms of broad ambition, you can really see, you know, how much they wanted to establish themselves as a state on their own, in addition to all of the skirmishes with the Indian populations. You know, John Sevier is trying to work with the Spanish government to secure a loan that would require Franklin to be placed under Spanish rule. So you have this tiny piece of formerly North Carolina independently negotiating with Spain in the 1780s. So, I mean, talk about making it up as you're going along, I think.
But the gall.
It's an absolutely wild story because the Spanish Empire is playing a huge role in what's happening here. They are supporting both the Creek and Cherokee nations in their battles against the American colonists because they don't want the colonists of the new U.S. to be encroaching any further west than they already are. But then they see this opportunity, these discontented settlers who they think they can kind of win over in order to have a foothold on the border of these new United States. And Sevier, you know, you mentioned John Sevier and John Tipton. Tipton was fully behind bringing the state of Franklin back into North Carolina. Sevier really wanted it to be independent. So like you said, he's negotiating with a foreign country. And no surprise, the man ends up arrested for treason.
Yeah.
Just, yeah. Like, you get put to death for treason.
Yeah. No, it's just wild. All of it is wild that he thought that he could accomplish this. But go ahead.
Well, and then his supporters break him out of jail. They drop the charges. And so here's this guy who's been independently negotiating with Spain, and he just strolls right out of prison. It's kind of amazing.
And flash forward to 1796, which was the date always burned into our brains, you know, for the origin of the state, you know, as a state, the state of Tennessee. John Sevier is its first governor. So, I mean, he made good.
Yeah. He landed on his feet.
He had such a wild time as, you know, part of the leadership of the state of Franklin. Because, you know, he and Tipton are constantly at odds with one another. So much so that at a certain point, they're literally at war with one another. Do you guys remember the details of the Battle of Franklin?
I know it only lasted like 10 minutes.
Speaking of delusions of grandeur.
And it involved, I believe, was it preceded by Tipton persuading a county sheriff to take Sevier's property for back taxes? Like, you know, stabbing each other in the back, left and right, it seems.
It's
yeah.
kind of amazing. Yeah, he was like, look, this is technically still North Carolina's land. That means you owe North Carolina taxes. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take your property. And Sevier's like, I have a militia. Now what are you going to do? Yes, they sorted out pretty quickly.
But it's wild to me how near the end of this quote-unquote country's sovereignty or lifespan, that people who are living there are just like, yeah, you know what? I'm going back to North Carolina. Like, they're like, people just start to leave because there is no, I mean, it's chaotic. There is no sort of central rule or government or legislature or way of sort of creating a sustainable government going forward. And so the people who are there get kind of disillusioned and decide it's probably best to just abandon the ship.
Yeah, it seems like they get tired of all the drama.
Yeah.
There was a lot of drama. And I mean, there was this move to try to win people over to having this independent government. And the leadership of the state of Franklin are like, you know what? We're going to give you like a tax holiday for the next 2 years. But suddenly they don't have any money to provide any services or to defend the state of Franklin. And of course, people are going to be like, yeah, let's go back to North Carolina and see if they can handle this a little bit better. That is ultimately what happens. The state of Franklin dissolves. It becomes a part of North Carolina again. As Jane was saying, it then becomes part of Tennessee come 1796. I'm curious, Jane, how you would describe Eastern Tennessee once it becomes Tennessee. Like, what is that part of the state known for? What's it like?
Well, it's certainly known in a lot of ways for its rugged beauty. You have the Smoky Mountains. In a more contemporary context, it's known as, the home of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. You can see that bright orange of the football stadium from the highway. I'm sure you'll see it on your drive down. Dolly Parton, Gatlinburg. But it's really known for, in a lot of ways, its unique cultural expressions, but also its insularity. I mean, it's become, it's sort of, part of Appalachia. It's very remote, and it's the people there are, you can sort of see, when they say, I'm done with the drama, there's a real sense of self-reliance, of the kind of ethos of what later comes to be known as the volunteer state comes from that region. So there's a city of Sevierville, so he left his mark there as well. Wow. But it is very much known for its ruggedness.
Kelly, the one other thing that I know about Eastern Tennessee is that in the 19th century, it was kind of a hotbed of radical abolitionism. How do you see that fitting in with this story of Franklin?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that when you think about how people are moving westward, slavery is expanding westward, which is also happening in a lot of the 19th century, more to the deep South than it is to like places like Tennessee, although there's slavery there. But this idea of having free soil, of not necessarily having slavery around, slavery that undercuts free labor. It undercuts people's ability to make money and generate wealth for themselves, because you have a slave that's going to do it, for free, essentially. No one's going to pay your labor to do it. There's a lot of resentment against the institution of slavery and how it undercuts free labor and undercuts people's ability to generate wealth for themselves. So you do have these factions of people that are very much, loyal to the Union when the Civil War breaks out, that have never been a fan of the institution of slavery. It's not a narrative I think we talk a whole lot about, because Tennessee gets stuck within a Southern narrative, but it's fluid in a lot of places. And I think it's really interesting to talk about it in that way.
I completely agree, just especially in the sense of the, how Tennessee becomes part of, the more 20th century political regionalizing of the South in terms of the Southern strategy. You can really feel, in a lot of the cultural differences between, other parts of the state and East Tennessee, that sense of independence from, the cultural understanding of what the Deep South is. And I agree that it's super interesting to think about, where those roots might have blossomed a little bit more in the late 18th century and going into the 19th.
And bringing the state of Franklin back into it, how much of that free soil ideology was based on the idea that first we have to remove all the indigenous people, and then we have free soil where we can declare our independence from the slave system.
Yeah, it's problematic, to say the least. I mean, the idea of like getting rid of Native American people, but then also not wanting slavery. I mean, none of it makes a whole lot of sense in terms of how we think about human beings, but that was the way things were.
Yeah.
So I was curious about, Kelly, you brought up, how to think about the Civil War and, in relation to what we've been talking about. And it put me in mind of this quote from the Constitution. So, this thinking about how, sort of the lasting vestiges of the state of Franklin did contribute to the inclusion of a clause in the Constitution about the formation of new states, which I think was so interesting. The clause being that new states may be admitted by Congress into this union, that new states can't be formed, quote, within the jurisdiction of any other state or states unless those state legislatures and Congress both okay the move. So there's a kind of acknowledgement in some ways, at least for me as someone who, didn't learn about this in school growing up, that seems like maybe the lasting imprint of the state of Franklin.
Yeah, that there's this idea that like, we're not going to allow you to create a state within a state. However, if we all agree, then there's a window open, which I think to me, it's still sort of wild, but I feel like even in, Tennessee in some ways is sort of similar to Texas. I feel like, we talked about Texas before having all of these different identities, being its own country, and then sort of having spaces within that space that become so different. Austin, Texas gets sort of singled out as being so different from the state of Texas itself. I still think you have a lot of that, resonating within the ether, within the environment, that play out in really interesting ways politically, we'll just say.
And a really important legacy of the state of Franklin, because you still have those secession movements within states, like the state of Jefferson in Northern California, but they can't leave unless the rest of California says, okay, get out of here.
Yeah. It's crazy. I think about the people that lived in the state of Franklin and then got married. Is their marriage now invalid? You think about the fact that they were issuing marriage license or issuing land and all of these things. It's like, how do you tease that out when you decide that you're no longer going to exist? It becomes really problematic.
Yeah, sorting out those land titles 4 years later is going to be a mess.
The wills.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Thank you, Jane Carr. You're going to join us for one more episode after this.
I'm super excited. Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, Kelly.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.